Are you keeping up with the latest in workplace health and safety in Australia? Psychosocial safety is now more important than ever, with new regulations emphasising the duty of care to prevent psychological harm. Join us on the 29th of August for a rapid-fire webinar hosted by two FlourishDX experts as we tackle these pressing challenges and pave the way for future best practices in psychosocial safety. Gain insights on beyond engagement surveys by learning how to more accurately quantify psychosocial risks. Discover strategies for improving the governance of psychosocial safety. Understand how to provide ongoing monitoring of psychosocial hazards and the effectiveness of controls. And determine the prerequisites for empowering line managers to take ownership of psychosocial safety. This webinar is a must for any health and safety or HR professional dedicated to creating a safer, more productive work environment. Don't miss out on this vital opportunity. Register now to ensure your organisation takes the lead in psychosocial safety. Visit www.flourishdx.com to register. See you there. Now on to this episode.
From FlourishDX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Better than you, I think, Jason.
Oh, I'm on the back end of a lurgy, but I'm pretty close back to 100%.
Your voice is much more masculine than usual.
Usually, I thought it was pretty masculine to start with.
Well, yeah, but it's extra deep and raspy.
But anyway, moving on. How are you today, Joelle?
We had a bit of a morning. I think term 3 is just doing its thing.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we had one of those with our 9-year-old this morning as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, is what it is.
Here's what it is, but it's his birthday party
on the
Saturday,
weekend,
isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. So what's he doing this year?
Going to an indoor trampoline place. So, yeah, they'll all bounce out all of their energy, and then I'll fill them up with cake and send them home.
I think it's your responsibility as a parent putting on a party to make sure they're sugared up before they go back home to their parents.
That's it. And I'm pretty sure the trampoline place doesn't want us giving them cake first and then sending them out to jump around and vomit it all back up again. So
This is true. This is being responsible.
it is, yes.
Nice one. All right. Well, we've got a guest joining us from across the ditch, so we should probably introduce her in.
Good idea.
Okay, so this person has extensive experience working in the New Zealand Public Service, supporting better healthy safety and wellbeing performance, including supporting cross-sector activity relating to psychosocial safety as a member of the Government Health and Safety Lead's Psychosocial Technical Advisory Group. She is the Manager for Workplace Wellbeing at the New Zealand Ministry of Social Development. A very warm welcome to the podcast, Millie Thompson.
Hi guys, thank you for having me.
Mate, it's been a mission, Millie. We've wanted you on here for probably 2 years, and due to scheduling conflicts and you just being a very, very busy person, it's taken a while, but we finally got you.
Yes, it has been a while, and I feel really bad. I went gallivanting around the world before I finally got back to on a date for this. So it's really great to be here. So thank you for having me.
Oh, so difficult. 5 weeks in Italy. Oh.
It was a hard slog, Jason. It was hard.
You should never feel bad about choosing a holiday over recording a podcast with us, Millie.
No, I don't. Don't worry, Joelle. I love you guys.
The New Zealand winter would be pretty cold, so probably a bit nicer in Italy this time of year.
Oh no, actually you say that. So we got to the Dolomites and it was like okay weather, and then we got to Lake Como and I thought, like peak European summer, and there was like the most wild thunderstorm I have ever seen. So much worse than any New Zealand winter I've ever seen. I was like, I've flown all this way and it is like the most horrendous weather. So not all of that, but it got better progressively, which was good.
I'm glad.
Me too.
All right, Millie, what podcast do you like to listen to?
Oh my God, so this is really embarrassing. And I saw when you sent through the questions, I was like, man, I'm actually not a big podcast listener. So I'm going to blame my partner Chris for that, because he is a big podcast listener, so big health and safety nerd. And there probably isn't like a day in our house where there isn't a health and safety podcast playing in the background. So I kind of am like a vicarious podcast listener. So I would say I know a lot about the Safety at Work podcast, Disastercast, of course, the Psych Health and Safety podcast. So that would probably be the extent of my podcast listening. So yeah, very much vicarious.
However it gets into your brain, Millie.
That's what I say, and I'm like, I feel like I've got quite a bit of my health and safety education just literally through like listening around my house. So
And I did see Chris was on a podcast recently himself. So I've actually downloaded that one to listen to later around governance around health and safety.
yeah, it's a good one. So they're talking about replacing New Zealand's Blue Book, which is all around good practice for governance. So worth a listen, I would say.
And can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Absolutely. So, gosh, it seems ages ago now. So I started doing my undergrad psychology degree, and I always intended to be a clinical psychologist. I think many, undergrad psychs, so I was like, that's the pathway I'll go for. But I thought that, before going on to do my postgrad, that I would take some time out and get some work experience. So I went and worked for the Accident Compensation Corporation, which is New Zealand's uh, injury rehab. How do I describe them? I worked for them. They process claims around injuries and accidents. So I worked in their sensitive claims unit, which is a specialist unit that was really focusing on supporting New Zealanders who'd experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault. And so my role there, my first role as an admin person, and my first exposure to the workforce was reviewing, 40 hours a week of reviewing probably some of the most graphic reports of sexual abuse and sexual assault. So often, unfortunately directed towards children. And my role there was, literally 40 hours of just reading the most graphic reports and redacting names so these reports could go out to our providers. And unfortunately, you're probably expecting this, I completely burnt out. So I became really, really psychologically unwell. Developed an anxiety disorder and actually had to exit the workforce for a period of time. So not the best exposure to the workforce, but what that did was it really, really changed my trajectory in my career, because I became really, really curious about workplace wellbeing. So what are we doing to actually stop workers from being harmed who are exposed to potentially psychologically hazardous work? So that really pivoted my career towards organizational psychology. And so I started looking for ways to actually get into much more of a workplace psychology field. So from there, I went to work for WorkSafe New Zealand, which is New Zealand's primary health and safety regulator. But at that time, they weren't really doing mentally healthy work per se like they're doing now. So there was some stuff around fatigue, bullying, but it wasn't quite where I wanted to be focusing on. So I jumped over to the New Zealand Defence Force, which was much more hands-on, supporting military personnel with their well-being and helping to implement a new strategic direction for the entire force. And there I jumped over to the Government Health and Safety Lead, where I met you guys. So I was their Principal Advisor for Mentally Healthy Work, which I led a program of work which was all around really shifting a strategic direction for an entire sector towards really, breaking that tertiary cycle. So big focus on how we support workers once harmed to actually, what are we doing in terms of, preventing or, managing that harm by actually looking at these risks and taking a systematic approach that, prioritizes elimination controls. So from there, I started to jump back into the sector where I am now at the Ministry of Social Development as their Manager for Workplace Wellbeing.
Yeah, so sorry to hear about that early experience for you, but I think really we talk to so many people who have had that type of an experience where they've gone to do their job and in particular where there is that requirement to engage with traumatic content. We do see these types of injuries happening, and employers don't really seem to connect the dots around, well, it's part of the job, so what else can we do? And they don't really think about it in the same way that they might think about protecting physical safety, where, working at height might be part of the job for a scaffolder, but we don't just focus on hiring scaffolders with good balance and hoping for the best. Like we have systems of work in place to stop them from falling and to catch them if they do fall.
Yeah, and it's like I just remember there was such a focus on, oh no, you couldn't hack it, and it was like, and it happened almost every week. You'd see someone leaving, and I remember at first when I saw other people kind of going through it, it was like, oh, they just, they weren't resilient enough, and the rest of us can do it. And then you realize actually there's something quite wrong about this, and actually if it's like it's happening to everyone, and the churn of staff was immense. So it was just like, why we're not looking at the work factors, and why is there such an expectation for workers, in this business just to kind of put up with it? And I like to share kind of my experience, and I see it, everyone I talk to, someone's had an experience of that, whether it is kind of that exposure to really traumatic stuff, or it is just, a really toxic boss or really excessive workload. Actually, it kind of, you know, almost liberates them to be like, oh, it's not just me not being good enough. There's actually a problem with the work, and actually, yes, there should be an expectation on my employer to be managing these things. So I think it is really important that we do tell our stories, and we really normalize the fact that it's not just you not being good enough or resilient enough, that actually there's a much bigger problem here around how we're setting up and managing work. So
Yeah, it's almost kind of a similar mentality to that old idea of the accident prone worker, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, look, it's off to a great start already, Millie. That's quite interesting, and obviously we heard in quite a lot of detail from Zegi Kozarov at the PHS conference, which you're too busy gallivanting around Europe
I
to
know,
come
I'm
along
so
to.
sorry I missed it. How was it?
Oh, it was fantastic. Anyway, but we know that people can really love their work, be really passionate about the work, but the work can still be very harmful due to the content of the work. So yeah, again, unfortunate that you've experienced that, but great that you're able to share with people, hey, this isn't you. This is actually the work that's causing you to become unwell. The question I've got for you is around workers' compensation statistics. And when we talk about mental injury workers' compensation claims, I believe it's a bit different in Australia versus what people can claim for in New Zealand. So we'll probably talk about that. But in Australia, because people can claim for a broader range of mental injury, if you like, we do see disproportionately higher numbers of psychological injury claims in the public service compared to private. First of all, is that similar to what you see in New Zealand? And then we might talk about the differences in the workers' compensation schemes.
Yeah, so I definitely think that our data does show that public sector workers in New Zealand tend to make more ACC claims for psychological injuries than private sector. Some of the stats definitely support that, but as you've highlighted, I think the big thing we need to talk about here is that kind of difference between Australian workers comp and ACC system. And I'm pretty sure you had Josh Darby on the podcast quite a while ago, and he probably touched on this because he's been one of the people in New Zealand that's quite vocal about it, is that our ACC, has a much narrower acceptance criteria. So usually it has to be a one-off acute event directly involving that person, where a diagnosable mental illness or injury results, which is really, really problematic because we know that it's not often how harm plays out, and that it's often, especially in frontline roles, it's through that cumulative harm through multiple exposures, which makes it really, really difficult for people like our firefighters, our police, our corrections officers, case managers, to put in a claim for a psychological injury, because they're exposed to a number of events, and that harm can kind of incrementally happen over time through that cumulative exposure. So we're probably not seeing as many claims as we possibly should, but yeah, the data does show that our public sector typically does have higher rates of claims than our private sector, for sure.
Yeah, and that is then, I guess, people are claiming for PTSD. Then, I guess, if you're saying it has to be, really acute, to be justified as a claim or accepted as a claim.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, so limited because we know that it's not often just this like one-off event. And I think one of the big cases in New Zealand was the Brickell case, which was, quite a big one for us, where it was a police photographer who had, like a 30-year career of seeing the most horrific things. And it wasn't till right at the end where he, suffered harm. But there was a huge debate around, is he eligible? Because, they couldn't pinpoint just one thing, but it was years and years and years of photographing the most graphic crime scenes. So that's one of the things that New Zealand, I think we need to do. Have a bit of a look at our ACC criteria for that, because right now it's just not conducive to people actually making claims for real harm that they're experiencing that doesn't meet this really really narrow criteria.
Yeah, and I think that's probably got a ways to go because if they look over at Australia, they'll probably be really scared at like the amount of claims that are being made for mental injuries and the costs associated with that. I mean, our workers' compensation scheme is pretty much at a tipping point where it's very unsustainable if it keeps going in the same direction. And so, without the systemic controls at the employer level, it's probably not worthwhile changing the workers' compensation scheme because otherwise, your workers' compensation is probably going to fall over.
Well, no, and that's exactly why. And, they are an insurance company after all. And so there is, a financial element there that we know that if we open that can of worms, that actually it is going to be extremely costly. But I think it comes down to a question around, is it the right thing to do? And I think it is. And I think also we kind of need that because then it's going to push much more of that focus on, okay, well, how are we preventing this then? If we know it's costly once they're harmed, how are we designing things upstream so they aren't getting to that point where it's really costly for New Zealand to actually then look after them? Because we know that, once they're out of the workforce and they're psychologically harmed, there's a huge cost with that. It's really, really expensive. So I am optimistic that one day there will be a refresh of that in New Zealand. But I think we do look at Australia and we're a bit like, oh gosh, yeah, that is a very, very costly exercise.
I mean, the cost is there, right? It's just a matter of who bears it. Um, so if it's not being borne by an insurance scheme, then it's being borne by the people who have been harmed and sort of their families and the community. Um, and then we can look at knock on impacts for the economy in having people out of work for those periods of time, being unpaid for potentially prolonged periods of time, and potentially having um, their career trajectory minimised, and their lifetime earnings significantly reduced, because of that experience at work. Um, all of those costs are still there, and a lot of them are impacting, sort of at that taxpayer or at that national economy level. It's just not captured in a single budget line. So it's not easy to point to as saying this is the impact that this is having, or this is the cost of these injuries. But yeah, the costs are still there. They're just more sort of hidden and dispersed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does make it so hard because you can't really quantify that, whether it's through the public health system or, just even the impact on, families and quality of life. And there's so many flow on effects that, we really can't capture, but we know probably is there. So, yeah, definitely a big one, eh?
Yeah. No, the public health system one is a good shout out because that's one of the big focuses of the Productivity Commission inquiry into mental health in Australia back in 2020. At the time, I think federally there's about $9 billion a year spent on mental ill health. And one of the key recommendations was, hey, employers actually need to prevent work-related harm that's readily foreseeable, and that was one of the you know of several kind of things that came out at a similar time, saying that we needed to elevate psychological health and safety to the same level as physical health and safety. Don't just make it harder for people to claim, which is what's happening with work cover in Victoria, but actually make people not get harmed as much.
That
That's
would
the
be
better way
nice,
to do
wouldn't it?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Millie, can you tell us about the work performed by public servants and what it is about that work that might lend itself to higher rates of psychological injury?
Yeah, so I mean, I always think it's important to acknowledge that, public sector and private sector do share many of the same psychosocial risks. So I'm not saying that public sector is, crazy special or anything. So I think when I say that, people are like, well, we have, high workloads too, and we have poor workplace relationships. So absolutely, there are a lot of same psychosocial risks. But I also think that public sector work is unique in a number of ways. So the most obvious one is that, a lot of our frontline first responder type workers, they have to run towards harm. So the ones that we, typically think of, that may be exposed to potentially psychologically hazardous work or traumatic work. So, police, firefighters, corrections officers, so people whose day-to-day work often exposes them to situations where, they might be harmed or people want to harm them. But there are also the types of roles that we, don't typically think of, where people are exposed to types of work that I think New Zealanders, wouldn't even dream of. So before I kind of worked for ACC, I had no idea that there was a role where someone's 40 hours a week was reading about child abuse. It's like absolutely horrific. So I often think of those kind of more invisible types of roles where, they're exposed, even just MSD caseworkers, for example, hearing about extreme hardship day in, day out, serious crime investigators, our DIA, digital safety teams responding to child exploitation. So some really unique types of work and, unique exposure to, quite emotionally heavy content. And I think that we forget that public servants often have to do this under, quite interesting and unique kind of context. So one of the big ones is probably, the bureaucratic constraints that they work under. So they're facing, quite difficult work, and they're also doing this under, really intense bureaucratic constraints that are often, not visible to the public. And they're trying to meet the expectations of the government of the day. They're navigating, complex political dynamics, and they're often doing this under, quite significant resource constraint that introduces other, non-traumatic psychosocial risks to the mix. So it's like they've got both that mix of like traumatic stuff, but also, really difficult situations around, reduced resourcing and a lot of public scrutiny as well. And I think that's another big one, that they're doing all of this, and also there's this huge focus by our public and our media. So there's often there's probably not a day that actually goes by where I don't see a New Zealand public sector agency on the front of one of our newspapers or media agencies. So and I think we saw that a lot during COVID for the likes of our Ministry of Health, where there's just such an intense focus on their work and their decisions and their actions, and the outcomes of these decisions are being really heavily scrutinized. So they're doing difficult work under often quite constrained environments, and they're doing it in a way that has to uphold expectations of different people, and they're doing it with a lot of people externally kind of criticizing them. So I think there are certainly unique aspects of public service work that can make it more psychologically hazardous and create unique risks for them.
Yeah, so I suppose one of the ways that we would normally seek to reduce opportunities for harm coming from sort of mandatory trauma exposure in a role would be to reduce other loads, right? So that we're sort of freeing up capacity within the individual to cope with the things that are not avoidable. But within a public service context, that bureaucracy that's actually built into the legislation in many cases means that a lot of those other demands actually can't be managed away, can't be sort of reduced or removed. They're sort of a mandatory requirement of working in the public service as well. So, yeah, a lot of those strategies that we might think about using aren't as easy to do in that public service context.
Absolutely. And I think it is really tricky, because when there are more risky types of work, you really want to be looking at how you kind of design and build in the capacity and capability for that ability to withstand that. And unfortunately, there often is not enough money to do that. And so workers are going straight into frontline work, often without enough training. There's not enough support. The managers that, oversee these people don't even have the capacity themselves. And we know that really strong leadership is such a protective factor. So we've got multiple kind of areas where risks are kind of coming together, and we're increasing that overall load. So there is definitely problematic, but in saying that, I recognize that this probably does play out everywhere, and that there are macro and micro factors that drive risks and exacerbate conditions for everyone. But obviously I'm a big advocate for the public sector, having been a public servant for so long, and I do see day in, day out how this plays out for people. And I think it's work that really is in the service of others. And I would love to see, it be fully supported and resourced and recognised as that. So yeah, an interesting one for sure.
So, Millie, you kind of really touched on it, but obviously the public service is structured in a certain way that there's additional kind of hazards that, maybe people working in private sector wouldn't experience to the same degree. So thinking about things like bureaucracy, levels of hierarchy, that. Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. Sort of thing. How does that look in public servant land, and how does that contribute, I guess, to the overall stress load, I guess, that people experience?
Yeah, so I'll need to be a little bit careful what I say here because I'm obviously still a public servant, and disclaimer that none of what I say is about my current organisation. So I'll probably step back and just speak a bit more objectively here. But I
And
do.
that's the story. That's the story we'll tell as well, Millie.
Yes, good, yeah, perfect. But yeah, I do think that the public sector, it is pretty bureaucratic, and I think it is bureaucratic at times for good reason, though. So we are operating on taxpayer money, so it is really, really important that there are processes and checks to make sure that things follow a process and that they're done well. So I think that is quite important. But we know that there is a balance that we have to strike because we know that red tape can be a hindrance to demand and it can create more work for people and it can be really constraining to work with them. And naturally, I do think that the public sector can be very hierarchical as well. And again, sometimes for good reason. So we do expect a high level of performance and a high level of accountability in the public service. And we know that hierarchies do help establish that, clear chain of command, which is crucial in high stakes situations where we need quick decisions or there could be widespread impact. And that clarity, it helps to ensure that orders are followed and accountability is maintained, which is really, really important for, think of health, police, defence, etc. But then, of course, we know that there's types of work that really is quite stifling for things like creativity, diversity of thought, innovations. That's obviously why we typically see flatter structures in industries like, creatives and tech. But I think while that hierarchy is really, really important in some public service agencies, we know it can create things like power imbalances, reduced autonomy, perceptions of poor, org justice, which we know are psychosocial risks. And I think, on top of that, kind of stepping back and looking at a macro level, there are also some really, really fascinating aspects of public sector structure. And how work is directed and who actually can be held accountable under HESWA, which is our Health and Safety at Work Act in New Zealand. So under our HESWA, our ministers and our members of parliament, they don't actually have liability for the management of health and safety risks in the public sector. So despite the fact that they can set priorities and that can indirectly or even directly influence where an agency places their efforts and resource, they actually don't have the same level of legal obligations as CEs or boards do. So theoretically, you have a situation where a minister could be saying, you must reach X target, which they've publicly committed to, but also I'm going to reduce your workforce and funding by X amount, which we know from a psych health and safety perspective, it has the potential to really increase that likelihood of harm, from risks to excessive workload, poor resourcing and so forth. So quite a unique dynamic in which, an individual has, quite significant influence, but may not be as actively incentivized for ensuring that health and safety is appropriately prioritized and resourced. So I think there are overall definitely some really unique and interesting aspects of kind of the way that the sector is structured for sure.
Yeah, and despite the work that we've done together, Millie, I hadn't even considered that previously, that the role the minister plays and them not being liable for any of this uh, health and safety performance of the organisation, despite them, setting targets and deciding on level of resourcing for their portfolios.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and not at all to bash ministers. I know I've worked with ministers. They are humans too. Deeply care. But I do think we do have these health and safety obligations for good reason, because they help us. When there are productivity pressures, that we are making those trade offs where people could be harmed. So really, really important that they are legally responsible. So it's just a really interesting one where, we just have to, I suppose, navigate that. So, yeah, interesting one for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd imagine there's a lot of education then that has to happen regarding, hey, this is the potential consequences of making this decision, and hopefully there's consultation between the minister and the CEs um, before they decide on some of these things.
Yeah, and I think that's really where it's important. And a lot of my focus with you guys actually in my previous role was on actually building that capability in chief exec. So they're actually able to talk about that and talk about, this is the consequence of this type of work. And this is where work may have an impact on the psychological health and well-being of our workforce. So actually having that conversation, changing that narrative. So I don't believe that any minister or CEO would actively sit there and be like, yep, let's just harm our workers. I think a lot of it is because they're human, they're under pressure, they're trying to make decisions, they've got things they have to achieve, there's public scrutiny, there's all of that. So they're doing the best that they can, but actually they might not be aware of, how these things might play out.
Super interesting.
So, Millie, I'm interested in the idea of, I guess, people who have a calling to work in a particular field, and how that might interact with the public service. So we know, for example, teaching and nursing and other types of carer or caregiving types of industries. A lot of the time, the people work there because they do feel like that's their calling, and they have that real sort of intrinsic motivation to do that work. Do we see a similar type of calling for public servants?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know in the New Zealand Public Service, we talk a lot about this thing called the spirit of service, and it's actually mentioned in our Public Service Act. So it's explicitly called out as this thing, and I think it's something that in New Zealand we really really celebrate, and I think it encapsulates how for many public servants work isn't just a job or a career. It is actually a calling for them to serve others and to serve New Zealand. And we know that someone's orientation to work can really influence the value that they place on work and really be tied to their identity and their meaning and purpose. But I do think that can be a bit dangerous when these people are exposed to potentially psychologically hazardous work, as I've seen that spirit of service at times contribute to situations that can result in harm. So, but bringing that back to the employer, though, I don't think the fault lies with the employee, as the employer has created and enabled that context, and they have that duty to manage the risk. But I do see employers sometimes develop a bit of an over reliance on this kind of intrinsic motivation or effort by workers to compensate for system issues or failures, like relying on workers to work overtime or constantly going that extra mile, or, putting up with lack of resources or exposure to violence and aggression. And I'm pretty firm on, like the goodwill and emotional dedication of your workforce absolutely can't be the fuel that runs the engine of your business. You have to make sure that your business is organizing and managing work in a way that is sustainable and healthy for workers. So we aren't just like churning and burning through them. And I know that that's got quite similar kind of parallels to a safety two narrative, where health and safety recognize within health and safety, sorry, that recognizes that the adaptability and skill of workers make imperfect systems work. So employers may be at the top looking down, and they'll see things working really really well, and they might just think, oh, it's because we've got all the right policies and systems in place, and they're actually not seeing this broken system because workers are making it work. They're absorbing that. And so that's why I think it's so important important that we're peering in and we're assuring ourselves that we actually do have the right system components and processes in place. And it's not just workers kind of making it work, where they're facing all these things, and the goodwill of them, of and their spirit of service is carrying us through. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, and I do think people that are in those kind of caring professions potentially are more at risk of that.
Yeah, and again, if we look at that sort of from a demands model, right, and the additional demands involved in understanding the dynamic sort of system that you're working within, understanding how it's intended to work, and then what action you need to take to actually make sure that it does continue to work, um, and sort of doing that in parallel with doing the job that you're employed to do and managing all of the demands associated with that job. Again, it just sort of adds to that cumulative load on people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think I really see it get quite normalized that these people just kind of expect it, and they absorb it, and it's just part of that work, which I think is, yeah, it's not a healthy place to be at times.
Yeah, definitely.
So, do you think risk gets normalized in industries like that, where you've got those helping professions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think risk absolutely gets normalized, both for workers and for leaders. So we know that when unwanted events, happen on a frequent basis, that threshold for what's risky starts to shift. So leaders and workers kind of start to see it almost as just normal work, potentially to the point where it doesn't even register for them. So for example, I think violence and aggression is so commonly accepted as just normal in parts of public sector. And I always think about, if a business has never experienced a staff member being, verbally or physically abused, then one report of that on a senior leader's health and safety report will get a lot of attention. They'll almost be like, oh my goodness, like how's this happened? But then if they're seeing dozens of reports every month in which this is happening, which is, this happens day in, day out in public service, then I do think it can become a little bit of the same old, same old. So they're kind of becoming a little bit numb to it. And likewise for workers, I think if they've never experienced physical or verbal violence and aggression at work, then if they do experience that, they're going to come home and tell their family and friends and colleagues, and it's going to be such a extreme event for them. But if you're a corrections officer or a police officer, or actually even an MSD caseworker, you experience this almost on a weekly, daily, hourly basis, and I think your view can start to shift to such a point that you do just see it as part of the job. And I think that's one of the things that can make psychosocial risk assessment quite hard, and present reporting challenges. If a worker no longer perceives that risk because they're so normalized to it, then they're not going to report that exposure as often. So we might not be actually as aware of what they're being exposed to. So things can very much look like they're in the green, but it's really just that it's been normalized so much by them, and that reporting might not be accurate. And then that kind of perpetuates quite a vicious cycle, because the executive don't actually have an accurate picture of that exposure or potential for harm. And then sometimes if they do, they're also just so normalized to it. So it's a really, really tricky one. And I have seen some absolutely, wild examples in my previous role at GHSL, where every single day we're having reports of this. And I can't even imagine what it's like, working at somewhere like corrections, where every single day they'll have prisoners, spitting on staff, attacking them, and it's like it's never okay, but it's so integral, such a massive part of doing that job. So I think definitely it gets normalized in industries like this.
Yeah, that makes me think of some. So we recently collected quite a lot of data from retail workers in Australia, and found kind of quite a similar pattern with sexual harassment, where we had lots of workers reporting really frequent occurrences of sexual harassment from customers in particular, but not really rating it as having a severe wellbeing impact. Which I guess you sort of, it's quite sad to think that these workers are in this situation where they kind of frame that as, well, this is just normal behaviour from customers and just something that I have to deal with, and not actually think about it as really quite inappropriate behaviour, and not something that they should actually have to tolerate as part of their employment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, I see that, in a physical health and safety sense too. And I've got builder mates, and like every day they're exposing themselves to kind of like paint and toxins. And I'm just like, I think if you're so exposed to something and it's just part of that job, you normalize it. Then it's like that harm might not be immediate, but it shows up later. So it's like we can't just say, oh, it's fine, it's part of the job. It's actually something that we need to really pay attention to. And I think that's where it's really important that the employer recognizes, there's no safe amount of kind of this traumatic stuff that you can be exposed to. So from day one, before you're even showing signs of harm, we're going to be making sure that the mechanisms are in place to keep you safe and keep, tabs on what that experience is like for you. So that's where I'm pretty firm on, we can't just be waiting for, years later where harm is occurring. We need to be focusing right now on, making sure that we've got the right controls in place.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in sports, right, where there's high impact, like AFL here in Australia, for example, where we're much more conscious about concussion, and we know a lot more about it. And often the effects of concussion don't really appear until many years later, sometimes decades later, right? Um, we know already there's enough data that shows that exposure to these psychosocial hazards can cause long-lasting impact on people's mental health. The data's there, and I think employers who aren't responding right now are leaving themselves wide open, as what many AFL clubs are now experiencing with former players suing them for breaches to their health and well-being because of multiple concussions that they experienced.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, eh? I was curious, what have you guys seen in your like? Now I'm now interviewing you guys. What have you guys seen like actually makes a difference with helping to like unnormalize this stuff? Because I know in my current role, it's just really really fascinating to come in, and a lot of people at MSD, they've worked there. They're like it's amazing since really really young. They've started as a case manager and they've gone through to being quite senior managers. And I just think when you are exposed to that for so long, it is really normalized because that's the environment that you just come to kind of become accustomed with. And so I'm so curious. I'm like, oh, how do you shift that? I was wondering, have you guys seen any ways of like really shifting that or kind of breaking that kind of that cycle?
That's a real challenge, I think, where you've got that acculturation that happens, and where you have these people who have they've sort of got their battle scars, and they see that as their evidence of legitimacy in the role almost. And well, I went through it and I survived, so that's what everybody else should be doing as well. And if I can do it, they can do it. We see that type of attitude coming through very very consistently in those types of industries where people have been sort of working in that sort of through their career, even like in sort of law firms. And we see a lot of information about, or a lot of reports about law firms having some really toxic behaviours coming from sort of partners and senior members of those firms in terms of how they interact with their junior staff and that sort of thing. But it's very much that sort of cycle of abuse almost, where this is how I was raised into this industry. This is how I learned how to do things. This is how I learned to be resilient or tough or whatever. And so that's now how I'm going to do it as well. I don't know that we've really got the answer to that. I mean, what we do have in Australia is our Work Health and Safety Act and regulations that we can really point to, and also the amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act in relation to sort of sexual harassment and that duty to prevent. So we do have, I guess, those legislated levers that we can pull a little bit and say, well, that may have been acceptable when you were going through this process, but the world has changed, the laws have changed, and you're actually currently breaking the law in the way that you're doing this now.
Can we steal those laws from you? Because we really need those over here.
But Millie, like it's not just the legislation; it's the enforcement of the legislation. And I don't believe your regulator has kind of like the resources that our regulators have here in Australia to enforce. So we're seeing lots of prosecutions, lots of improvement notices, occur. We've had our first enforceable undertaking in this space for a minor here in WA. So it's actually, it's the enforcement of the legislation that makes the impact. And I think that's probably it, Joelle. Like, when people see, oh, look, there was a lawyer who took her own life in 2018 who was working in a toxic work environment, and her employer was held to account. They broke the law, and it's a criminal conviction. Um, that makes a difference. That gets the whole industry to look introspectively and go, well, okay, we've said that's okay, but clearly it's not. So yeah, there's no easy answer to it, but prosecutions, I think, are starting to make a dent in how people perceive these inherent risks that they have normalised.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
definitely.
think like especially when we're talking at an executive or board level and having those discussions there, that case law in particular does have a real impact because until a judge has made a ruling on something, the way that the legislation may be interpreted is sort of it's all hypothetical. But yeah, where we have, and Jason mentioned the Kozarov case earlier, and the ruling there actually said this is what a safe system of work should have included for this role, where there was that sort of inherent vicarious trauma exposure, and so that is like such a strong piece of case law because it actually says these are the elements of a safe system of work, and if you don't have those, then you are essentially vulnerable to being prosecuted.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I know I personally have used so much of the Australian case law to kind of give leaders in the public sector a bit of like this is what's coming. This is kind of what we should expect, and it is so powerful because until it reaches that point, they are a bit like, well, what does that even mean for me? What does it look like? What are those actual consequences? So I'm very grateful to Australia for taking the lead with that, and hopefully we will follow suit. But yeah, Jason, you do touch on an interesting point that we haven't quite got the resourcing or the support yet within our own WorkSafe to kind of get those prosecutions really, really taking off. So I'm optimistic that we will follow suit, but yeah, good things take time, eh?
So, Millie, what could employers in the public service start doing differently now to improve mental health outcomes for their workforce?
So, nothing really groundbreaking that I could say that I don't think you would have already heard on the podcast. But I think one of the big things is actually just doing the basics really, really well. So, pragmatically, there are a few things that we know, make a really big difference if they're done well and done consistently. So, I'm always harping on about, creating a psychosocial safety climate. So, having leaders that genuinely display that, authentic commitment to prioritizing psychosocial safety even when it is in tension with productivity or other goals. And I think we look at the likes of Josh Darby's research that shows that perceived support is so highly protective for people in those kind of frontline responder roles. And then of course actually just getting some basic psychosocial risk management in place. So we really need in the public sector our employers to get really, really clear on the scenarios in which our people could experience work-related psychological harm, identify and embed the controls that can ideally prevent or mitigate these scenarios, and ideally look at a bit of a hierarchy of controls approach. Right now we're so stuck in this tertiary cycle of just doing things that support people once harmed, or still very much stuck in kind of the generalized fluffy, the stuff that we always talk about. And one of the big things that I think is also really important, which we often forget about, is that assurance piece. So, really, really monitoring the effectiveness of these controls, because we're talking about a complex systems problem, right? So it's not like we can just put in place, one control matches that risk and it's this linear relationship. There are so many factors that can kind of influence how things play out. And when it's humans, it can be subjective and dynamic. And that's where I think that monitoring piece is so important. But one of the big things, and it's probably, you would have seen it when I interacted with you guys in the GHSL role, is getting competent support. So recognizing that, this is a specialist field and it does require specialist knowledge. So that doesn't mean that, every public service agency has to bring in an org psych, but I think simply using like a generalist wellbeing advisor or a health and safety professional or an HR specialist it won't always be enough, and we have to accept that. And we have seen in New Zealand case law for other matters that actually has been specified that you have to have a competent person in order for a risk assessment to be deemed actually effective. So we need public sector agencies, like everyone else, to be able to see through when they're getting kind of marketing spin from these, well-intentioned wellbeing specialists out there, to actually bring in the right, specialist to actually make sure that, that work is being done well. We're actually investing in the right things that actually do make a difference. Because, yeah, unfortunately, I have seen people who, really, really well intentioned, giving advice that, potentially isn't evidence based. Or sometimes it's just, complete nonsense. We've seen a lot of that, the resilience apps, the wellbeing type stuff. I know that we in this field talk about as not really making a big difference. So, yeah, one of the big things is getting that competent support for sure.
Yeah, and we do see that in Australia. There are, lots of people who have generous wellbeing kind of backgrounds. Even I've seen people with marketing backgrounds who are now saying, "Oh, we've developed a psychosocial risk assessment for you to use." So it's a good shout
It's
out to,
everywhere, eh? God.
yeah, yeah. It's a it's a bit of a concern. Hey, Millie, it's been a really fascinating conversation with you so far. But given that you do consume this podcast vicariously, at least when you're walking around the home, you might know the question that's about to come. And that is, if you were to think about the future, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health be?
Oh my gosh, where do I start? So yeah, I mean, I guess I'd really love for this field to be seen as a specialist technical field and not just kind of uh, well-intentioned, well-being, fluffy stuff that I see leaders asking for. So it actually is a serious technical field that we need to, respect. So I'd like to see that. Um, yeah, and probably one of the big ones is actually seeing, leaders really, really own this and actually see them focusing on, risk factors and controls being adopted, not just kind of health and safety professionals trying to desperately persuade them to actually do this. I'm like, this should be a fundamental thing that leaders are really, really driving forward. Um, and probably one of the big ones that would be amazing would actually just see that evidence base for specific controls and interventions, grow more. So I think it's really, really powerful when you can show a decision maker, that what they're investing in is either absolute nonsense, like the whole resilience app type stuff, or, what we're seeing out there that actually makes a difference. So those would probably be my top hopes for the future.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see more evidence-based practice. And for those who are tuning in for PHS Con 2025, that will be one of the key themes. And we're even flying Professor Rob Briner across from the UK, who's a specialist in, or he's an organisational psychologist who focuses on evidence-based practice, because that's really what we're talking about when it comes to psychological health and safety. It's taking that evidence-based approach where we understand the baseline, we put in an intervention, and then we test to make sure it's actually been effective. And when we do that, like you say, then the CEO, CFO, they're happy that the investment they've made is actually worth it.
So, final question for you today, Millie. Do you have words of advice for listeners who are interested in working in the field of psych health and safety?
Yes. So first of all, I would say absolutely do it. It's a great field to work in, and we definitely need more great people. But I think I'd also say to people considering, working in this field, that it's not just about being a technical expert. So I know it's really important to have that background, but I see it across health and safety that we actually need people who are curious, people who are systems thinkers, and people who are really, really good influencers. So you don't just have to be a complete health and safety technical nerd. There are other kind of skills that we really, really need in this space. So some of the most, effective people that I've seen working in health, safety, and wellbeing are actually the ones that can blend, sound technical knowledge with great communication skills and that presence to really, really inspire and engage others. Um, but I think I'd also say that you are coming into a field that is still, especially in New Zealand, developing in maturity and that consistency of application. So expect challenge, expect frustration, and expect sometimes some really silly stuff popping up. But I suppose just also know that it's work that's incrementally shifting the dial on people's experience of work. So really, really meaningful and cool work. So if you're up for it, come join us.
Excellent.
Those are some great words of advice, Emily. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, again, fascinating conversation with you today, Millie. Thank you. I think you did public servants proud, and really, I think that was a great exploration of some of the key issues and challenges that we need to think about when applying psych health and safety within the industry. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video when we have our guests on, and you can catch those videos on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. You'll also find that we take some of the highlights and put them as short clips on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. And while you're on LinkedIn, Joelle and I frequent there quite a bit, so feel free to drop in and say good day and to continue the conversation. But thanks again. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.